The moment Romy Reiner opened the door to her father's guest house, the air seemed heavier than usual. She had been expecting the quiet comfort of a weekend visit, maybe some laughter over breakfast, a chat about the usual family trivialities. What she found instead would haunt her forever. The scene inside was unthinkable. Her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, lay motionless, their lives violently cut short. And in the room next door, the one belonging to her youngest brother, Nick. There was something that made her blood run cold. Something that whispered danger, hinted at premeditation, and raised a terrifying question. Had she been living under the shadow of a monster all along? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. If you've ever wondered how a family tragedy can unfold from the familiar into the unimaginable, this is that story. You might think you know someone. You might trust them implicitly. But sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, in the corners of a room, in the silent things people keep locked away. And when the truth finally emerges, it can shatter everything you thought you knew. It's hard to even imagine the emotional weight Romy carried as she made the call to the authorities. She had always been close to her parents, protective of them in ways only a daughter can be. And yet, as she stood in that home, the walls adorned with family memories, photographs capturing decades of smiles, holidays, and milestones, she knew the world she had taken for granted had changed in an instant. The unthinkable had happened. And worse, the person she feared might be responsible was someone she had shared her life with, someone she had once trusted without question, her brother. Nick Reiner was 32 years old, living in the guest house of the Brentwood estate that his parents had purchased decades ago, a sprawling $13.5 million property that represented the family's success and influence. But wealth, as this story would soon prove, is no safeguard against darkness. Within the walls of that estate, behind the polished marble and curated art, lay secrets that were both chilling and inexplicable. And at the center of it all was a mask. Not just any mask, but one that would leave forensic experts, law enforcement, and the Reiner family grappling with questions that seemed more suited to the pages of a thriller than real life. What was it doing there? Why had it been left so prominently in Nick's room? And most importantly, what did it signify about the events that had unfolded that Sunday morning? The media was quick to descend on Brentwood, cameras flashing as neighbors whispered theories that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. But behind the headlines and the sound bites, there was a story of human complexity, of trust betrayed, and of the terrifying realization that evil can wear a familiar face. Romy, 27, was the one who made the initial report, allegedly telling the police about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. Those words would ripple outward, forming the foundation of a narrative that combined grief, fear, and disbelief in equal measure. Imagine, for a moment, standing where she stood. You know someone intimately, your brother, your sibling, your flesh and blood, and yet, as you look around a room filled with everyday objects, something in the arrangement, the objects themselves, sends a chill down your spine. What would you do? How would you process the tension between love, fear, and suspicion? Romy's story is not just a story of crime. It's a story of human psychology in extremis, of how our perceptions can be manipulated by appearances, and how the things people hide can ultimately reveal the darkest truths. And then there was the mask. No one could have anticipated the sheer symbolic weight it carried. Masks, in criminology, often signify more than disguise. They signify intent. They can denote premeditation, ritual, or a disconnection from empathy. For Nick Reiner, whatever the mask represented, it was not merely an accessory. It was a statement. And for the family who discovered it, it was a signal of danger that they could not ignore. As Romy, Tracy, and Jake Reiner processed the scene, the questions multiplied faster than the answers could arrive. Why had Nick chosen to live so close to his parents? Had there been warning signs they had all missed? And most hauntingly, how could someone who had grown up in the same household, surrounded by the same values and traditions, arrive at a point where violence became conceivable? These are questions that law enforcement would wrestle with, questions that psychologists would analyze, and questions that the public would speculate on endlessly. But for the Reiner family, the answer was immediate, visceral, and heartbreaking. Trust had been shattered, and the consequences were irrevocable. You might think that wealth and influence provide protection from tragedy. After all, the Reiners were a high-profile family, with a lineage that included Hollywood success and public admiration. But tragedy does not discriminate. Murder, betrayal, and grief arrive with equal potency in palaces and modest homes alike. What this story reveals, however, is that sometimes the most frightening discoveries are not about money or fame. They are about the darkness lurking in those closest to us. The mask in Nick Reiner's room, the evidence of his planning, and the chilling foresight Romy demonstrated in alerting authorities all point to a calculated chain of events that demands scrutiny. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about family, perception, and the human capacity for violence. And yet, even amidst the shock and grief, there are patterns, signs, and contradictions that make this story more than just a recounting of murder. There is psychology, there is behavioral analysis, and there is a narrative that unfolds with twists and turns so dramatic, so unsettling, that it keeps even the most skeptical observers on edge. Could the warning signs have been seen earlier? Were there moments when intervention was possible? These questions hang over every page of this story, unanswered and persistent, driving both family and audience alike toward the inevitable confrontation with truth. For those of you watching or reading, consider this. How well do you really know the people you love? How well do you understand the shadows that may exist behind a familiar smile, a shared joke, or a routine dinner conversation? The Reiner tragedy serves as a chilling reminder that appearances can deceive, that danger can be intimate, and that sometimes the most horrifying discoveries come not from strangers, but from those we think we know best. And as this story unfolds over the coming chapters, each revelation builds upon the last. Each clue uncovers deeper layers of motive and intent, and each twist challenges what you thought was possible in a family setting. By the end of this story, you will have seen the pieces that led to one of the most shocking family murders in recent memory. You will understand the significance of the mask, the chilling foresight Romy had in identifying danger, and the psychological patterns that suggest premeditation. You will witness the public, the police, and the family themselves grappling with a reality so surreal it almost defies comprehension. And as the narrative moves forward, each chapter will peel back the layers of secrecy, betrayal, and horror, culminating in an understanding that is as disturbing as it is necessary to comprehend. The Reiner name carried weight long before the tragedy unfolded in Brentwood. To the public, it conjured images of Hollywood success, creativity, and influence. Rob Reiner was more than just a filmmaker. He was a symbol of a golden era of cinema, someone whose work shaped the cultural landscape and whose presence was synonymous with prestige. His films, his public persona, and his carefully curated image gave the impression of a life of accomplishment, stability, and sophistication. But as anyone who studies families, fame, and tragedy will tell you, appearances can be deceiving. Behind the red carpet and the cameras, behind the accolades and awards, a story was quietly brewing. A story of human vulnerability, of familial tension, and, ultimately, of horror. The Reiner family's history is rich with creative genius, but also with a legacy of high expectations. Rob, the son of the legendary Carl Reiner, grew up surrounded by talent, pressure, and the persistent public eye. It's easy to imagine how this upbringing shaped his children, Tracy, Jake, Romy, and Nick. On paper, they were the perfect heirs to a family legacy steeped in accomplishment. They were attractive, educated, and positioned to continue the Reiner influence in both entertainment and society at large. But families of prominence often struggle under the weight of expectations, and the Reiners were no exception. Tracy, the eldest, had navigated the spotlight with caution. She was known for her poise, for her ability to maintain distance from the media, and for being the steady anchor of the siblings. Jake, the middle child, had a more adventurous streak but was still closely tied to the family's ethos, the sense that the Reiner name was both a gift and a responsibility. Romy, the youngest daughter, had always been perceptive, sensitive, and deeply connected to her parents. And then there was Nick, the youngest son, whose life would soon become the focal point of a tragedy that no one could have anticipated. Nick's presence in the family dynamic was complex. On the surface, he was like any other son, intelligent, charming when he chose to be, and embedded within the family structure. But beneath that veneer lay behaviors that unsettled those who knew him best. Subtle signs of volatility, obsessive tendencies, and an inclination to isolate himself were observed, though they were often dismissed as quirks or teenage rebellion. These early behaviors, small and seemingly insignificant at the time, would later take on terrifying significance. The Brentwood estate itself symbolized the Reiners' success. Spread across acres of meticulously landscaped property, the home was a sanctuary, a space for family gatherings, holidays, and quiet reflection. Marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, and walls were lined with photographs capturing generations of Reiner's milestones. It was the kind of home that spoke of security, wealth, and accomplishment, but wealth cannot shield a family from tragedy. And as the events of that Sunday morning would reveal, even the most secure walls cannot contain human darkness when it festers long enough. To understand the events that would shock the world, it's essential to appreciate the family culture. Rob Reiner was known for discipline, for expecting the best from his children, and for valuing intellect, creativity, and responsibility. Yet, like many prominent families, there were pressures, comparisons, and the unspoken tension that often arises when children are measured against the towering legacy of their parents. In this context, small disagreements, unexplained absences, or secretive behavior could easily be overlooked, dismissed, or rationalized. The Reiners, despite their attention to detail and their public image of perfection, were not immune to the complexities of human behavior within a family. Friends and colleagues described the Reiners as close-knit, but family insiders hint at fractures that were rarely visible to outsiders. Long-standing sibling rivalries, disagreements over personal choices, and differences in temperament contributed to an undercurrent of tension that often went unspoken. Nick, in particular, had a reputation for being unpredictable, emotionally intense, and prone to withdrawing into his own world. These behaviors, combined with the pressures of living within a family of prominence, created a dynamic that would, in hindsight, seem like a ticking time bomb. Yet, it wasn't just the family's internal dynamics that mattered. It was how these dynamics intersected with opportunity, isolation, and access. Nick lived in the guest house on the Brentwood estate, a seemingly mundane arrangement that would prove significant. The proximity to his parents provided daily interactions, yet the physical separation of the guest house allowed for private spaces, unobserved routines, and, ultimately, the concealment of actions that no one anticipated. The guest house became, unknowingly, both a sanctuary and a stage for what would unfold. The day of the murders would highlight how ordinary spaces can become extraordinary sites of tragedy. The family's wealth, the estate's size, and the carefully maintained distance between structures all played into a situation that made it easier for devastating events to occur without immediate detection. Romy's arrival that morning, her instinct to check on her parents, and her subsequent discovery of both the bodies and the disturbing items in Nick's bedroom underscore how a single moment of observation can change everything. As the investigation unfolded, attention naturally turned to the family's public persona. How could such a tragedy happen in a household so seemingly perfect? Was there something in the Reiner upbringing that had contributed to Nick's alleged actions? Did the pressures of legacy and expectation intersect with psychological vulnerability to create the perfect storm? These questions were not merely rhetorical. They formed the basis of police inquiry, media coverage, and public fascination. People wanted to know not only what happened, but why it happened, and whether it could have been predicted. Yet for those closest to the family, the questions were far more personal and far more painful. Tracy, Jake, and Romy were left to navigate the dual shock of grief and suspicion. Trust had been shattered. Safety had been violated. And as they processed the items in Nick's room, including the mask that would become the most talked-about piece of evidence, the lines between love, loyalty, and fear blurred. Families, even the wealthiest or most celebrated, can be fragile in ways that are invisible until a crisis strikes. The mask itself would become a symbol of both mystery and menace. Law enforcement described it in clinical terms, but for the family, it represented something deeply unsettling, a glimpse into a side of Nick they had never fully comprehended. Masks in criminal behavior often signify more than mere disguise. They suggest intention, ritual, and psychological projection. And as experts would later note, the presence of such an object within a personal space like a bedroom was not incidental. It suggested planning, awareness, and a disconnection from empathy that was deeply alarming. In addition to the mask, other items in Nick's bedroom provided clues, pieces of a puzzle that investigators, psychologists, and the Reiners themselves would have to interpret. Journals, notes, and seemingly innocuous personal effects took on new significance when contextualized against the backdrop of murder. For the family, each discovery forced an uncomfortable reckoning. How well had they truly known their youngest son? How could normalcy and violence coexist in the same person? These questions would not only haunt the Reiners, but also captivate public attention as the investigation proceeded. The Reiner family legacy, therefore, is inseparable from the tragedy that unfolded. It was a family steeped in public admiration, wealth, and achievement, yet internally complex, nuanced, and vulnerable. The very traits that made the Reiners successful. Attention to detail, high standards, a culture of expectation, also masked the warning signs that would later become critical pieces of evidence. In analyzing this legacy, it becomes clear that the tragedy was not merely a random act, but the product of multiple intersecting factors: familial dynamics, personal psychology, environmental opportunity, and a series of overlooked indicators that, in retrospect, screamed of impending danger. And yet, even with this understanding, questions remain. What led Nick Reiner to cross the line from private struggle to public atrocity? How could the items in his bedroom foreshadow events so catastrophic? And most importantly, what could have been done to prevent it? The answers, as we will explore in the coming chapters, are as complicated as they are chilling. Who was Nick Reiner? That question would dominate headlines, social media speculation, and private conversations for weeks after the murders. To the public, he was simply the son of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the youngest in a family that had always seemed perfect on the surface. But the tragedy in Brentwood revealed that perfection was a facade, and that Nick's life, personality, and history held a series of warning signs that were either missed, misunderstood, or deliberately ignored. Understanding Nick is essential, not to excuse, but to explain, the events that would shake the Reiner family to its core. From an early age, Nick showed traits that were, at times, charming, at times alarming. Family friends recall a boy with intense curiosity, a sharp intellect, and an unusual sensitivity to his environment. But alongside these positive traits were darker tendencies. Nick was known to withdraw for days at a time, immersing himself in private pursuits and isolating from siblings and friends. His family initially interpreted these behaviors as introversion or the eccentricities of a young adult growing up under the weight of a famous name. After all, what family doesn't have moments of tension or privacy? But these periods of isolation would later take on ominous significance. School records and reports from teachers described Nick as intelligent but unpredictable. He excelled in certain subjects, often demonstrating a capacity for abstract thinking that was above average for his age. Yet, he was also prone to emotional outbursts and conflicts with peers. Small incidents, arguments over minor disagreements, tendencies toward obsessive behavior, and a sometimes volatile temperament were dismissed as youthful indiscretions. But in hindsight, these were the early echoes of a personality that could become dangerous under the right circumstances. Nick's adolescence was marked by increasingly noticeable patterns of secrecy. He was meticulous about his personal space, his journals, and his digital devices. Friends noted that he often changed routines without explanation and could become deeply agitated if questioned about his private affairs. While many teenagers display some level of secrecy, Nick's behavior was intense, bordering on compulsive. The family interpreted this as the behavior of someone who valued privacy, but investigators would later argue that it was a sign of premeditation, a desire to control what others saw and understood about him. Social interactions with his siblings, Tracy, Jake, and Romy, were inconsistent. At times, Nick was warm, protective, and charming. At others, he could be distant, irritable, or unpredictable. Family gatherings, which on the surface appeared normal, sometimes hid tension that few outsiders noticed. The Reiners, like many families, had patterns of managing conflict privately. Arguments were settled behind closed doors, disagreements were minimized, and behaviors that might seem alarming to an outsider were rationalized as personality quirks. This context is important because it demonstrates how someone with dangerous tendencies could remain under the radar, even within a vigilant and attentive family. Financial independence, or the lack thereof, also played a role. Nick lived in the guest house on the Brentwood estate, separate from the main home, but close enough to interact with his parents regularly. This arrangement was meant to provide him with autonomy while keeping him integrated within the family structure. But autonomy in this context also created space for secrecy. He could maintain private routines, store objects without scrutiny, and develop behaviors unknown to the rest of the family. The guest house was both a symbol of independence and a physical space where danger could incubate unnoticed. Mental health factors cannot be ignored when examining Nick Reiner's trajectory. While specific diagnoses remain confidential, law enforcement and psychologists would later describe him as displaying signs of emotional instability, obsessive tendencies, and potential delusional thinking. These traits, combined with environmental stressors such as family expectations, societal pressure, and access to the home and its resources, created a volatile combination. While mental illness alone does not predict violence, in Nick's case, it intersected with opportunity, premeditation, and access in a way that would ultimately prove deadly. Friends and acquaintances also provide insight into Nick's personality. Some describe him as intelligent, articulate, and engaging in small doses, but also as someone whose moods could shift abruptly. Observers noted that he sometimes fixated on unusual topics or displayed interests that were intensely private. These behaviors, while not criminal in themselves, contributed to a portrait of a person whose internal world was opaque to those around him. For a family accustomed to openness and engagement, this opacity created blind spots that would later become painfully significant. Nick's adult life did not markedly alter these patterns. While he participated in family events, engaged in social activities, and maintained professional ambitions, his private behaviors remained largely hidden. Journals, personal projects, and the items found in his guesthouse bedroom suggested an obsession with order, secrecy, and control. These items, discovered after the murders, included the infamous mask, cryptic notes, and objects that hinted at premeditation. Each object, seemingly mundane in isolation, painted a picture of a young man whose inner life was fraught with intensity and, ultimately, danger. The day of the murders was a culmination of these patterns. Nick's access to the estate, his knowledge of routines, and his ability to operate under the radar allowed him to execute acts that would devastate his family. But before that day, there were numerous subtle signals, interactions, and incidents that, in retrospect, formed a chain of warning signs. The family's love for Nick, their desire to protect and trust him, and their reliance on appearances over investigation delayed any intervention that might have altered the outcome. What makes Nick's story particularly chilling is the contrast between his public persona and private reality. To acquaintances and friends, he could appear normal, even charismatic. Within the family, he had moments of warmth, connection, and apparent empathy. Yet, behind closed doors, the behaviors that would culminate in murder were developing quietly, methodically, and without overt detection. This duality, charming on the outside, dangerous on the inside, is a hallmark of cases that shock the public, because it forces everyone to confront the unsettling truth that someone can appear familiar and safe while harboring the capacity for extreme violence. Family accounts suggest that Nick had always been a subject of concern, but the warnings were vague, fragmented, and difficult to interpret. Romy's comment to the police about a dangerous family member was rooted in lived experience and intuition. She had seen patterns, behaviors, and potential signs of threat, but articulating them in a way that would prevent tragedy proved impossible. This tension between intuition and reality, between perception and action, is central to understanding the events that followed. When investigators entered Nick's room, they found evidence of obsession, secrecy, and preparation. Items such as the mask, Cryptic writings and meticulously organized personal effects revealed a mind attuned to control, symbolism, and premeditation. Forensic experts would later argue that these were not merely eccentricities, but indicators of a psychological state capable of planning and executing violent acts. And for the Reiners, the shock was amplified by the knowledge that the person responsible for this evidence was their own son. The youngest child they had raised, nurtured, and loved unconditionally. Nick Reiner, in essence, was a study in contradiction. Brilliant yet disturbed, charming yet volatile, intimate yet secretive. His life trajectory, when examined against the backdrop of family dynamics, mental health factors, and environmental access, provides critical insight into how tragedy can unfold within a family. Understanding Nick is not about excusing his actions. It is about comprehending the layers of complexity that made the events of that Sunday both possible and, in some ways, predictable. And as we move forward into the next chapter, the day of the murders, the stakes become painfully clear. Nick's history, personality, and behaviors intersected with opportunity, resulting in a catastrophe that would change the Reiner family forever. But what happened that morning was only the beginning, and the discoveries that followed in his bedroom would leave an imprint that no one could erase. Sunday mornings are often associated with peace, slow breakfasts, sunlight streaming through windows, and a sense of calm that carries the promise of a day without obligations. But for the Reiner family, on that particular Sunday, the morning would mark the beginning of a nightmare. By the time the day ended, 2 lives had been violently extinguished, a family's world had been shattered, and the quiet Brentwood estate had become the epicenter of a tragedy that would shock the world. The day began like any other. Rob and Michelle Reiner were at home, attending to their usual routines, unaware of the storm about to descend upon them. Nick Reiner, their youngest son, was in the guest house, going about his day with a quiet precision that, in retrospect, now seemed menacing. Observers would later reconstruct the sequence of events, piecing together moments that, at the time, appeared mundane. A door closing, footsteps echoing in a hallway, the rustle of papers, the sound of a television in another room. On a normal Sunday, these sounds are innocuous, ordinary. On this day, they were the backdrop to horror. Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, arrived that morning. Her visit intended to be brief, a check-in with her parents before heading off to her own weekend activities. She knocked on doors, expecting the usual greetings, laughter, or perhaps the aroma of breakfast. Instead, she encountered silence, an eerie, suffocating quiet that immediately put her on edge. Anyone who has walked into a space and felt an instinctive sense of wrongness knows the sensation. The hairs on the back of your neck rise, your pulse quickens, and the mind races to reconcile expectation with reality. For Romy, that instinct would save her life. As she entered the main house, the scene unfolded in ways she could not have imagined. Her parents were found stabbed to death, their bodies cold, and their lives extinguished in a violence that seemed incomprehensible. The discovery itself is traumatic beyond description. The shock, the disbelief, the need to process what is simultaneously undeniable and surreal. Romy's response, quick and decisive, was to alert authorities. In her mind, there was no time to dwell, no time to question. She knew that immediate action was necessary, and her awareness of potential danger within the family added a chilling dimension to her decision. From the outside, neighbors would later describe the scene as both tragic and bewildering. Emergency responders arrived, cameras and media began to converge on the estate, and the community was thrown into a state of disbelief. Questions began to circulate immediately. Who could have done this? How could a family so seemingly perfect experience such sudden and brutal loss? The narrative that would dominate public consciousness began forming even before investigators had finished securing the scene. But Romy's discovery did not end with the bodies. Her attention was inevitably drawn to the guest house, to the space occupied by Nick Reiner. Something in her mind screamed that understanding what had occurred required examining his environment, his personal space, his private life. What she found in that bedroom would add layers of complexity, fear, and horror to an already unimaginable situation. The room was organized, almost obsessively so, yet the objects within it spoke to a mind that was disconnected from ordinary reality. A mask, cryptic notes, personal journals, and various objects suggested premeditation, ritualistic behavior, or an obsession that no one in the family had fully understood. The presence of the mask, in particular, sent a wave of unease through Romy. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a simple costume item. To someone who knew her brother and who understood the potential implications, it was a warning. Masks are symbols. They conceal identity, project intention, and, in many documented criminal cases, signal premeditation or detachment from empathy. The mask in Nick's bedroom was more than a mere object. It was a statement, and it forced Romy to confront the possibility that her brother's actions were deliberate and planned rather than impulsive. Investigators, upon entering the guest house, would later describe the room as a window into Nick Reiner's mind. Every item had significance. Items carefully arranged suggested a person attuned to detail, organization, and control. Notes and journals provided insight into thought patterns, obsessions, and perhaps even justification for actions that crossed moral boundaries. From a forensic perspective, these details are critical. They offer evidence of intent, a timeline of planning, and a psychological profile that can be analyzed to understand the perpetrator's motives. For the family, however, these discoveries were emotionally devastating. Each object was a confirmation of betrayal, a tangible representation of the danger that had been hidden within the home. As the day unfolded, law enforcement began piecing together the sequence of events. Nick Reiner was arrested without incident, but questions immediately arose about motive, opportunity, and psychological state. Friends, neighbors, and family members were interviewed. Media coverage intensified, bringing public scrutiny into a situation that was already traumatic for the family. Every revelation, every detail, and every object found in Nick's bedroom contributed to a narrative that was both horrifying and compelling. The human element cannot be overstated. Romy's courage in reporting her suspicions, her ability to remain composed amidst unimaginable grief, and her insight into Nick's potential for violence prevented further tragedy. Her actions demonstrate the importance of intuition, observation, and decisive action in moments of crisis. At the same time, they highlight the heartbreaking reality that even with awareness, some events are unavoidable when circumstances converge in catastrophic ways. Throughout the investigation, the timeline of the morning was meticulously reconstructed. The murders themselves were swift and brutal, leaving little time for intervention. Nick's access to the main house, knowledge of routines, and familiarity with the estate's layout allowed him to act with efficiency. Yet, it was the discovery of his bedroom, the artifacts, the mask, the notes, that provided investigators, psychologists, and the public with the most insight into his state of mind. Family dynamics, long studied and observed, became central to understanding what happened. Nick's behaviors, withdrawal, secrecy, obsessive tendencies, were now seen as warning signs. The family's love and trust, which had previously shielded him from scrutiny, had inadvertently allowed for the concealment of dangerous tendencies. This dynamic illustrates a universal truth. Family bonds, while protective, can sometimes blind us to the reality of individual behaviors, particularly when those behaviors are subtle, gradual, and easily rationalized. By the end of the day, the Reiner estate was transformed from a site of comfort and security into a crime scene of profound emotional and psychological impact. The discovery of the bodies, the arrest of Nick Reiner, and the shocking items in his bedroom marked the beginning of an investigation that would capture national attention. But even as investigators collected evidence, and as the media speculated about motive and mental state, one fact remained clear. The world had witnessed an event that defied comprehension, and the Reiner family would never be the same. What happened that morning was only the beginning. The evidence found in Nick's bedroom, the psychological profile emerging from his behavior, and the symbolic weight of the mask would become central to understanding not only what occurred, but why it occurred. And as the family, investigators, and public grappled with these revelations, the story was far from complete. The guest house was supposed to be a place of independence, a space where Nick Reiner could live semi-autonomously while still remaining under the watchful care of his parents. To the family, it was a reasonable arrangement, a separate entrance, private quarters, and enough distance to allow privacy without isolation. But on the morning that Romy Reiner entered the main house, the guest house became a focal point of horror, suspicion, and chilling revelation. What she, or anyone walking in that day, would encounter inside Nick's bedroom was beyond comprehension. As Romy stepped into the room, she immediately sensed an unsettling order. Everything was in its place, meticulously arranged, as if the room had been curated not for comfort, but to convey a message. Her eyes fell on items that, in isolation, might have seemed ordinary. Clothing folded with precision, books stacked neatly, electronic devices lined up. But the arrangement, combined with the presence of other more disturbing items, created a sense of foreboding. There was intent here. There was planning. And there was a reality that Romy had never anticipated. Her brother had been living in a world that was entirely separate from the one she knew. The first thing that drew attention was the mask. It was grotesque, unfamiliar, and unmistakably menacing. Its presence was jarring in a space otherwise designed for day-to-day living. Law enforcement would later describe the mask as a psychological symbol, often associated with detachment from empathy, concealment of identity, and ritualistic intent. For Romy, the mask was an immediate and visceral warning. It was not simply an object. It was a manifestation of the danger she had feared, tangible proof that something in Nick's inner life had gone unchecked. But the mask was not the only alarming item. Notes and journals were scattered throughout the room, each page filled with cryptic writing, lists, and personal reflections. Some entries appeared mundane, reflecting everyday thoughts or observations. Others, however, hinted at premeditation, obsession, and a fixation on control. Investigators would later describe these writings as a psychological roadmap, revealing a mind both meticulous and methodical. For the family, reading even a small portion of these notes was devastating. They were a window into thoughts that none of them had been privy to, thoughts that now seemed to foreshadow the tragedy that had unfolded. Other items suggested an interest in ritual, symbolism, or control over life and death. Arrangements of objects, patterns in personal belongings, and even the positioning of furniture indicated a person attentive to detail in ways that bordered on the obsessive. To the untrained observer, it might have seemed like quirks of an eccentric young adult. To those who knew Nick, and to investigators analyzing the scene, these were clues pointing to a psychological profile that demanded attention. Each object was a piece of a puzzle, each placement a deliberate choice, and each detail a potential signal of intention. Romy's discovery of the mask and accompanying items forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. She had underestimated the depth of her brother's secrecy. The behaviors that had once seemed peculiar, perhaps annoying or confusing, now took on a menacing dimension. The room spoke of planning, of preparation, and of a mind that had rehearsed scenarios that the rest of the family had never imagined. The fact that these items were kept so close to the site of the murders, within the guest house adjacent to her parents' home, added another layer of chilling significance. Law enforcement entering the room later described the scene as both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that it was a bedroom, furniture, clothing, and personal effects, but extraordinary in the way ordinary items conveyed extraordinary intent. The juxtaposition of normalcy and menace created a cognitive dissonance that investigators, psychologists, and family members struggled to reconcile. How could someone inhabit a world so familiar, so domestic, and simultaneously harbor thoughts, obsessions, and plans that culminated in murder? This duality, mundane surroundings paired with sinister undertones, is one of the most psychologically compelling aspects of the case. Among the discoveries were objects whose significance would only become clear later in the investigation. Everyday items, once examined in context, suggested rehearsals, an obsession with control, and the construction of a psychological narrative that separated Nick from the reality of his actions. The mask, as the most visually striking and emotionally provocative object, became a symbol for both investigators and the public, encapsulating the disconnect between identity and intent. But alongside the mask were subtle signs of preparation. Lists, reminders, and sequences of actions that indicated careful planning. For the family, the discovery was overwhelming. Romy, Tracy, and Jake were forced to confront a reality that was impossible to ignore. The person responsible for the murders of their parents had been hiding in plain sight. The combination of intimate knowledge, psychological preparation, and access to the estate had enabled Nick to act with devastating effect. Each item in the bedroom reinforced the sense of betrayal, the understanding that their trust had been exploited, and the realization that the danger had been closer than anyone had imagined. As the scene was cataloged and evidence was collected, law enforcement and forensic experts noted the meticulous nature of the room. Patterns in the arrangement of objects, cryptic writings, and the presence of the mask suggested a mind that valued precision, control, and perhaps even ritualistic symbolism. These findings would later become central to understanding Nick's psychological profile, his potential motives, and the premeditated nature of the crime. The bedroom, in essence, was both a stage and a diary, a place where planning, intent, and obsession converged. The discovery also raised immediate questions for investigators. How long had these behaviors been developing? Were there signs that could have been intercepted? How much of this was symptomatic of deeper psychological issues, and how much reflected a conscious, deliberate preparation for murder? These questions, difficult and uncomfortable, were essential to constructing an accurate narrative of what had occurred. For the Reiner family, the emotional impact was profound. The bedroom was a stark reminder of the gulf between perception and reality. The trust they had placed in Nick, the familial bonds that had been assumed to ensure safety and loyalty, were now tainted by evidence of betrayal and danger. Each object in that room was a confrontation with the reality that evil can reside in the most familiar of places, and that the people we think we know best may harbor secrets capable of unimaginable harm. Even the most mundane items took on a sinister weight. Pens, notebooks, and organizational tools were no longer neutral. They were interpreted as instruments of thought, rehearsal, and preparation. The room's orderliness contrasted sharply with the violence that had occurred, emphasizing the dissonance between everyday life and calculated malevolence. The mask, however, remained the centerpiece, grotesque, symbolic, and impossible to ignore. It demanded interpretation, elicited fear, and provoked questions that would dominate the investigation and the family's understanding of the events. And yet, even with all of this discovery, the full scope of the bedroom's significance was not immediately apparent. Investigators would spend weeks analyzing patterns, cross-referencing notes, and seeking connections between objects and motive. Every item became a potential clue, every arrangement a potential indicator of intent, and every detail a piece of the psychological puzzle. The bedroom was not just a room. It was a repository of evidence, a window into Nick's mind, and a chilling prelude to understanding the actions that had destroyed the Reiner family's sense of safety and trust. The mask in Nick Reiner's bedroom was more than a simple object. It was a symbol, a signal, and a psychological puzzle all in one. Its presence immediately drew attention from family, law enforcement, and the media, raising questions that would dominate public speculation for weeks. Why was it there? What did it signify? And, most importantly, how did it relate to the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner? The answers, as would become painfully clear, were complex, disturbing, and deeply unsettling. At first glance, a mask might seem innocuous, a costume piece, a novelty, or a harmless artifact. But in the context of Nick Reiner's room, it carried a weight that no ordinary object could. Law enforcement experts and criminologists recognize masks as psychological tools. In criminal cases, masks often serve multiple functions. They conceal identity, depersonalize the act of violence, and sometimes provide the perpetrator with a sense of separation from their actions. The mask transforms a person from an individual with empathy and social constraints into a detached entity, capable of acting without the moral inhibitions that normally govern behavior. For the Reiner family, seeing the mask in their son's bedroom was jarring, almost surreal. How could a young man they had raised, nurtured, and loved possess an object associated, at least psychologically, with premeditation, disassociation, and potential ritualistic behavior? The mask was a tangible manifestation of danger, a silent warning that Romy, in particular, recognized immediately. Its presence was not incidental, it was intentional. It was placed, displayed, or stored in a manner that suggested awareness, deliberation, and perhaps even pride. Investigators quickly noted that the mask's design was unsettling. Unlike a simple Halloween accessory, it bore features that suggested menace. Exaggerated expressions, distorted human features, and a craftsmanship that lent it a sense of permanence. In the field of criminal psychology, objects like this are often interpreted as externalizations of internal states. The mask externalizes what the mind is attempting to detach from: the empathy, conscience, and recognition of consequences that normally restrain human behavior. For Nick, the mask may have served as a psychological bridge, enabling him to act on impulses or premeditated plans without confronting the immediate moral implications. Beyond psychology, the mask carried symbolic resonance. Throughout history and across cultures, masks have represented transformation, anonymity, and the assumption of alternate identities. They allow the wearer to step outside social constraints, adopt new roles, and act in ways that would otherwise be unacceptable. In criminal cases, masks are not merely disguises, they are statements. They signal intention, mark ritualistic or obsessive behavior, and, in some instances, communicate a psychological thrill derived from control and concealment. The fact that Nick had such an object in his bedroom suggested an awareness of its symbolic power, a conscious or subconscious acknowledgement of the distance it could create between thought and action. Forensic analysis later connected the mask to patterns observed in violent behavior. Experts noted that perpetrators who keep symbolic objects like masks often demonstrate premeditation, careful planning, and a desire to control not only their environment, but also the perception of their actions. It is not merely a matter of hiding one's face. It is about psychological distancing, creating an internal narrative that allows extreme behaviors to be carried out with less internal resistance. This is why the mask became central to the investigation. It was not a trivial detail, but a window into the mindset of someone capable of murder. The implications of the mask extended beyond Nick's own psyche. It altered how his family, investigators, and the public perceived him. Trust, already fractured by the violence, was further eroded by the realization that Nick had been harboring behaviors and interests that hinted at dangerous tendencies. The mask became a focal point in understanding the breadth of his secrecy, the intensity of his obsessions, and the deliberate nature of his actions. For the Reiners, every glance at it was a reminder that appearances can deceive, that danger can reside in the most familiar of places, and that knowledge, however sudden and horrifying, cannot undo the damage that has been done. Psychologists consulted on the case emphasized that the presence of a mask, particularly one stored prominently in a personal space, is rarely accidental. It represents planning, a cognitive rehearsal of scenarios, and, in many cases, a method of emotionally disengaging from the consequences of one's behavior. In Nick's case, the mask suggested a level of calculation that heightened the severity of the crime. It was no longer just a moment of impulsive rage. It was a manifestation of a mindset capable of detachment, control, and deliberate action. The mask also raises questions about communication. In some cases, individuals leave symbolic items to convey messages, assert power, or signal intent. While we cannot know definitively what Nick intended, the mask's placement and context suggest a psychological need to externalize his internal state, to create an object that represented aspects of himself separate from social or familial constraints. For Romy and the other Reiner siblings, interpreting this signal was terrifying. It confirmed fears that had been vague, intuitive, and unarticulated. The danger had been there, silently, in plain sight. In the days following the discovery, the mask became a symbol in media coverage. Headlines emphasized its grotesque appearance, speculated about ritualistic implications, and drew connections, sometimes sensationalized, to broader cultural narratives of crime and deviance. While media coverage often amplifies fear, in this case, the mask's symbolic and psychological weight was real. It was not just a prop for public consumption. It was evidence, an indicator, and a tangible manifestation of a mind in turmoil. The mask also forced investigators to ask deeper questions about motive and intent. Was it a tool to psychologically prepare for violence? Was it part of a ritualistic or obsessive practice? Or was it a more general reflection of Nick's detachment from reality and empathy? Each possibility pointed to a disturbing conclusion. The murders were not simply the result of an emotional outburst. They were connected to a psychological framework that had been developing over time, informed by secrecy, obsession, and perhaps a fascination with symbolic objects. For the family, the implications were devastating. Trust was not only broken by the act of violence, but reinforced as broken by the presence of the mask. It was a reminder that the person they had known, loved, and protected was capable of calculated, detached, and symbolic behavior that no amount of familial intimacy had revealed. Every glance at the mask was a confrontation with betrayal, a question of how well one can truly know a loved one, and a signal that the path to understanding the tragedy would be long, painful, and filled with unsettling revelations. And as the investigation unfolded, the mask became central to the narrative of Nick Reiner's actions. It would be referenced repeatedly in court documents, media coverage, and psychological profiles. It was a symbol not just of the murders themselves, but of the preparation, detachment, and psychological state that enabled them. For those trying to make sense of the tragedy, the mask was a key to understanding the why behind the horror. For Tracy, Jake, and Romy Reiner, the events of that fateful Sunday were not only a shocking external tragedy, they were a deeply personal confrontation with betrayal, fear, and the limits of familial understanding. While the world saw a high-profile family rocked by murder, the siblings experienced a complexity of emotions that no headline could capture. Grief intertwined with suspicion, love clouded by fear, and the desperate need to make sense of a nightmare that had invaded the sanctuary of their home. Tracy, as the eldest sibling, often assumed a protective role within the family. She had been the steady presence, someone who mediated disputes, offered guidance, and ensured that family gatherings retained a sense of order. On the morning she learned of her parents' deaths, Tracy's world imploded. Shock gave way to urgency. She needed to verify facts, check on her siblings, and ensure that immediate danger was contained. Yet, even in the midst of this crisis, she had to grapple with the horrifying possibility that the person responsible was her own brother. The duality of grief and suspicion created an emotional strain that would be impossible to articulate fully, but whose weight was felt in every decision she made that day. Jake, the middle sibling, experienced the tragedy through a lens of disbelief. He had always perceived his family as close-knit, resilient, and protective. Yet the murders revealed a fissure that had been invisible until it could no longer be ignored. Jake struggled with the idea that someone he had grown up with, someone he shared memories, jokes, and family traditions with, could commit such an act. His response, like Tracy's, was a combination of instinct and pragmatism. He focused on immediate safety, contacted authorities, and tried to maintain composure, all while internally processing the enormity of betrayal and loss. Romy's perspective is perhaps the most critical to understanding the initial investigation. She was the one who discovered her parents' bodies and immediately recognized that danger existed within the family. Her intuition, sharpened by years of observation and intimate knowledge of Nick's behaviors, allowed her to act decisively. Romy's immediate call to law enforcement was not only an act of courage, but also a recognition that the subtle warning signs she had sensed over the years were now manifest in a catastrophic reality. Her awareness was key. It prevented further harm, initiated the legal response, and provided investigators with insight that no outsider could have offered. The siblings' experiences cannot be separated from the emotional landscape of the morning. Imagine walking into a home that has been a source of security, love, and memory, only to find it transformed into a scene of unimaginable violence. Each room, each photograph, each artifact from decades of family life became a site of grief. The cognitive dissonance. The clash between what they knew to be true and the evidence before them was profound. The normal rhythms of family life were replaced by horror, confusion, and the urgent need for answers. In the hours that followed, Tracy, Jake, and Romy were forced to navigate a surreal combination of personal trauma and public scrutiny. Police investigations began immediately, and media attention descended upon the Brentwood estate. While the siblings were grieving, They were also providing statements, coordinating with law enforcement, and beginning to piece together the events that led to their parents' deaths. The juxtaposition of private grief and public exposure added another layer of stress, as the siblings were required to manage their emotions while engaging with the broader narrative being shaped in real time. The discovery of items in Nick's bedroom compounded their emotional turmoil. Each object, the mask, the journals, the notes, the meticulously arranged personal effects, was a reminder that the tragedy had been preventable, or at least predictable, in some way. For Romy, it was confirmation of the suspicions she had long held. For Tracy and Jake, it was an unsettling revelation that challenged their understanding of their brother, their family, and the nature of trust. The siblings were not merely witnesses. They were participants in a psychological reckoning, forced to reconcile love with fear, memory with reality, and familial bonds with betrayal. The mask, in particular, became a point of shared focus. Its grotesque presence, symbolic significance, and psychological implications created both fear and fascination. The siblings struggled to understand its meaning. Was it a warning, a manifestation of intent, or simply an object of fascination for Nick? The uncertainty intensified the emotional strain. For the Reiners, the mask was no longer a distant artifact. It was a symbol of the rupture in their family, an externalization of the danger that had been present but unseen. Communication between the siblings was also critical during this period. They needed to share information, compare observations, and coordinate responses to investigators' questions. Every conversation carried the weight of grief, suspicion, and the responsibility of protecting one another. Emotional bonds were tested as they navigated the delicate balance between processing trauma and ensuring that no further harm occurred. The shared experience of discovery, entering the main house, seeing the bodies, examining the guest house, created a bond of trauma that would forever define their relationship. The siblings' reactions also highlight the importance of intuition and awareness in family dynamics. Romy's ability to identify danger was rooted in long-term observation, familiarity with her brother's behaviors, and a sense of responsibility toward her parents. Tracy and Jake, while perhaps less attuned to subtle warning signs, responded with a combination of practical action and emotional support, illustrating the diverse ways that family members cope with crisis. Together, their perspectives form a mosaic of grief, fear, and resilience that informs our understanding of the human dimension of this tragedy. Psychologists studying family responses to trauma emphasize that such events disrupt not only daily routines, but also foundational assumptions about safety, trust, and identity. For the Reiners, the discovery that Nick may have been the perpetrator shattered assumptions about love, loyalty, and the predictability of behavior. The siblings' emotional responses, shock, disbelief, anger, and grief, were compounded by the cognitive task of making sense of evidence that suggested premeditation, secrecy, and psychological disturbance. The interplay of emotion and cognition in their responses is critical to understanding both the personal and investigative dimensions of the case. As the day progressed, the siblings faced a series of decisions: how to interact with law enforcement, how to communicate with the media, and how to process their grief without losing sight of immediate safety and legal considerations. Every step required navigating a labyrinth of emotion, responsibility, and ethical concern. Their experiences provide a window into the human cost of tragedy, illustrating that even when facts are established, the emotional and psychological toll is both immediate and enduring. For the Reiner family, the morning of the murders and the subsequent discovery of Nick's bedroom became a turning point. It was the moment when intuition, observation, and evidence converged. The siblings' perspectives, shaped by years of shared experience and intimate knowledge, became crucial to understanding the broader narrative. Their reactions were not only responses to trauma. They were active components in the unraveling of events, providing insight, guidance, and caution to investigators, while also navigating the deeply personal challenge of reconciling love with fear. From the moment Romy Reiner made the call, the gears of law enforcement began turning with precision and urgency. Police, forensic teams, and investigators flooded the Brentwood estate, each tasked with the monumental responsibility of uncovering the truth behind the shocking murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner. While the public would see only the headlines and brief news clips, the reality was far more intricate. A meticulous, methodical investigation that sought to uncover motive, establish timelines, and interpret the chilling evidence found in Nick Reiner's bedroom. The first officers on the scene were met with the kind of tension and chaos that no training can entirely prepare one for. A prominent family, a sprawling estate, two murdered individuals, and the looming question of whether the perpetrator remained nearby created a unique challenge. Officers secured the perimeter, ensuring that the estate was safe and that no one could enter or leave without scrutiny. Their first task: establish the facts as quickly and accurately as possible while preserving the integrity of the scene. The main house, where the bodies were discovered, immediately became a crime scene. Detectives began the painstaking process of documenting every detail: the position of the bodies, the state of the rooms, and any immediate evidence that could point to motive or perpetration. Simultaneously, officers turned their attention to the guest house, the residence of Nick Reiner. It was here that the investigation would pivot from general procedural assessment to focused psychological and forensic inquiry. Every object in his room, from the mask to the meticulously arranged personal effects, was cataloged and analyzed. Investigators understood that these items were more than curiosities. They were potential keys to understanding the mind behind the crime.